Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at Book 5, Chapter 27 from Caesar's De Bello Gallico. Now this chapter is actually pretty long, so we're going to split it into two parts just so that we can fit it into, sort of videos that aren't, going on forever basically. But remember, we're in the Gallic Wars and we're talking about Ambiorix's revolt. And we've said this a bunch of times, we're focusing on this sort of eastern fort and the winter quarters in 54 BCE. The Roman army is spread out, like we said, and at this point you're going to see that they're actually been attacked and they're trying to draw the Romans out of the camp. So in the last chapter, we saw in chapter 26, we saw that the Gauls had basically sprung a trap on the Romans while they're out foraging, and they were able to drive off the attack. And remember, Caesar talks about how great his men were, but not really Sabinus and Cotta, right? He doesn't really give them a lot of credit. In this chapter, we're going to see the discussions that happen afterwards, because right at the end of chapter 27, you had seen that someone had come forth to the fort, and he's saying they want to have a discussion so they can kind of find mutual peace and sort of common ground to end the fighting, right? And like we've been saying, this is all a trap to try to get the Romans out of their fort. So before we pick up the narrative there, what I always tell you in these videos, the first thing you want to do as much as you can is pre-read the story. So get any vocab that you might need. There's a bunch of commentaries out there you can use. Just try to read through and make a list of your own, or find them. Like I said, there's a lot out there, because knowing the words is sort of half the battle. It's really hard to understand what's going on if you just don't know what the vocab is. So work on the vocab, give it a pre-read. That always helps. Just anything to get yourself ready to go. And then read this part of the narrative out loud, right? Always read the Latin. If you can find a classmate, read it to them. They can read it back to you. That way, when you're doing your part, you're working on your speaking and your pronunciation. And when your classmate reads it back to you, you're working on your listening skills. That's always the best way to do it. You don't want to shut those off when you're really trying to understand the language. The other thing I would tell you to do is try the read and reread method. I say it in all my videos, but read through this chapter, or at least this part of the chapter, write down any words or phrases, any sentences you don't understand, just make a list. And when you're done with that first read through, go look at your list and try to figure out where you're going wrong. If it's vocab, that's really easy. Just look up the words, right? Practice them a little bit and you should be fine. If it's grammar, try looking at a commentary or anything you can find, trying to unpack where you're going wrong. And then you go back and do it again. And on the second, third, fourth read, you just keep repeating that process. Your list should get smaller and smaller and smaller until you're able to read through this whole chapter without too much help going on, and you're able to really figure it out. That's how you know you're ready to move on. You're in a good spot. Okay. So if you haven't done that yet, pause the video, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we're going to move through it and start translating on our own. But you want to just use my translation, not that it's ever perfect. Use it as a double check just to make sure that you feel comfortable that you're on the right track and ready to move on. So the chapter starts like this. You have mitito ad eos colloquendi causa Gaius Arpaneus eques Romanos familiaris quinti tituri et quintus Junius ex Hispania quiam ante misu Caesaris ad ambiorigem ventitare consuerat. Right, and then you have another line. We go apud quos Ambiorix ad hoc modum locutus est ... Right, so we got a very long line to start. Okay, but you have someone being sent. So you have Gaius Arpaneus, right, is the person we're talking about, right? He is sent to them, meaning to the Gauls, for the reason, the causa, for the reason of speaking, right? So you have colloquendi causa, right? That's the reason he's going. Now, Gaius Arpaneus is described as eques Romanus, right? A Roman equestrian, right? In some commentaries, it says knight, but that's a little, I feel like a little deceptive. But he's a higher class Roman, right? An equestrian Roman. Okay, and he's a familiaris, he's a close friend of Quintus Titurius, right? And Quintus Junius from Spain, ex Hispania, right? A certain Quintus Junius from Spain. So these are the two messengers that they send out, right? And it's Quintus Junius who already, right, or already before, and it's already before had been accustomed, consuerat, by the sending of Caesar to ventitare, to come often to Ambiorix. So if you kind of reboot that sentence, you're talking about Quintus Junius, who already had been accustomed before to come often. Ventitare there is what we call the frequentive. So it's to come often is kind of the best translation, by the sending of Caesar to Ambiorix. So in other words, he already knows Ambiorix because he's been sent a bunch of them, a bunch of times to him by Caesar, right? And you have apud quos. So among these, Ambiorix had said, right, or he said, locutus est, in this manner, and then we have dot dot dot. Okay, so among quotes, among these means like among these men. So Ambiorix is talking to these two men, right, the diplomats, and Caesar is reporting what he's saying. So the rest of the chapter here is basically one giant indirect statement because we're not getting a direct quote from Ambiorix. And I want you to think about that as you work right through this, because Caesar is not there, right? So he doesn't know exactly what Ambiorix said. It's being reported to him. So what Caesar is writing right now, it's not entirely fiction, I would say, but because he's not putting a quote, he's able to basically put words into Ambiorix's mouth and have him say whatever he wants, right? It can kind of be reported by Caesar. And this is what he has him say. So it starts like this. You have sese pro Caesaris in se beneficiis plurimum e confiteri debere, rather. Quod eius opera stipendio liberatus esset, quod aduatucis finitimus suis pendere consuesset. Dot dot dot, right? So there's a lot more that's going to come after this, okay? But he says that, right? So Ambiorix said that. That he, on account of the beneficiis Caesaris, right, on account of the kindness of Caesar to him in se. So in other words, on account of Caesar's sort of kindness to him and benefits to him, you might say beneficium, right? Is very much, right, is the thing that he's going to owe here. So it's saying because of all this, right, that he owed debere. Remember, it's an indirect statement. So say is really functioning as your subject, and debere is your infinitive. That he confessed that he owed, rather, right? Confitere. He confessed that he owed to him very much. So in other words, he owed to Caesar a lot of stuff on account of the kindness of Caesar. So that in and of itself, that first line kind of gives you a hint as to what's happening here. Caesar has Ambiorix start his speech by saying how much he owes to Caesar and how great Caesar has been to him. That should catch your attention as kind of something a little bit weird, right? And he says, and because of his stipendio, or sorry, on his opera, right, from his work, you might say, because of his work, eius opera, right, meaning Caesar's work, he liberatus esset, he had been freed stipendio, from a stipend or from tribute. So in other words, because of Caesar, Ambiorix doesn't have to pay the same tribute that other tribes do. And now he gives a little more about the tribute, rather. It's not to the Romans, but he had been freed from the tribute, which, right, quote, to the Aduatuci, right, the Aduatuci here, this another tribe, right, which to them, and they're described as finitimi suis, his neighbors, meaning Ambiorix's neighbors, he consuesset, he had been accustomed to pay, pendere, right? So that consuesset is really consuesset, right? The vi there, it's been shortened down, but that's really what you're looking at. It's the pluperfect subjunctive. So it's the tribute which he had been accustomed to pay to them. So he had been paying tribute to this neighboring tribe, and because of Caesar, he doesn't have to pay that tribute anymore. Okay, that's one of the things he owes him. Then you have quodque et filius et fratris filius ab Caesare remissi essent, quos aduatuci obsidum numero missos apud se in servitute et catenis tenuissent. Okay, so you have, and because, right, and again, it's going on more about things that he owes to Caesar. So you have something, the remissi essence, something had been sent back, to him, meaning to Ambiorix. Now, the something that got sent back are people. It's Filius, right? His son, and the fratris Filius, the son of his brother. So in other words, his son and his brother's son had been sent back to him by Caesar. So it's a reference here to the fact that Caesar had basically freed his family members, right? And set them back. And this is, again, another thing that he basically owes to Caesar. Okay, and it's his son and his brother's son whom the Aduatuci, right, the Aduatuci tribe, had held. Tenuissent is the verb there, right? They had held. Then you have numero obsidum. You can translate it as among a number with the numero, the ablative there. So among a number of hostages. Okay, so they had been keeping them as hostages. And the mesos there, that participle is kind of describing what's happening to the quos, right? So you can say whom, having been sent among a number of hostages, right? The Aduatuci, right, had held among them, right, meaning in their tribe, in servitude, in slavery, servitute, and in chains, catenis. So in other words, all these hostages, including Ambiorix's son and his brother's son, had been sent to this neighboring tribe. They were being held basically as slaves. Caesar has sent them all back and kind of straightened that out. So this is an interesting sort of thing where Ambiorix starts by talking about how much he owes to Caesar. And again, it's meant to be a ploy to say, look, I'm on Caesar's side, even though he's not. But notice how Caesar puts these words in his mouth, right? So when you read about how Caesar was so kind, he took away his tribute, and he sent back his sons, that's kind of interesting. It almost reads as if Caesar is listing all these great things to emphasize how much of a betrayal it is by Ambiorix that he would attack him, right? So that's the interesting part of this, and the fact that it's sort of the big indirect statement. These are Caesar's words being said through Ambiorix, okay? Then we keep going. You have neque id quod feceret de oppugnatione castrorum aut judicio aut voluntate sua fecisse, sed coactu civitatis suaque esse eius modi imperia ut non minus haberet juris in se multitudo quam ipse in multitudine. Okay? So you start with the neque here. So you have and not this, right? It's an indirect statement. So you're going to see like something else is going to happen here. Okay. So you can say this, which he had done, right? Fecere, which he had done concerning the oppugnatione, the attack of the castrum, right? The attack of the camp. So he's saying this thing, which, he did concerning the attack of the camp, right? Meaning what had just happened. Now, the main verb going with id there, right, because you have sort of the relative clause, is fecisse, right? So it's saying he had done this, which he had done concerning the attack on the camp, right? He had done this not, right, neque, he had not done this either. You have out. So you have out judicio followed by out voluntate sua, right? So not by his own judgment, right? The sua there is kind of going with both of these ablatives, voluntate and judicio. So it's saying he had done this not by his own judgment or his own desire, right? But by the coactu, the coercion, you might say, of the state. So in other words, he just went through saying how much he loves Caesar, right? So he says, I love Caesar. And what just happened, meaning, sort of namely the attack on the camp, I didn't do it on my own volition because I really love Caesar. He's like, no, I didn't do it by my own judgment or my own desire, but I was forced to by the civitatis, right? By the state, by my citizens. That's sort of the excuse that Ambiorix is using here. And again, you want to think about how that would play to a Roman audience, right? Hearing that it's not my fault, right? It's the people's fault. That would probably kind of ruffle the feathers of a Roman, sort of a lower or middle class Roman hearing this, like, man, I can't believe, here we go again, right? They're blaming the lower class people here, okay? Then you keep going with this indirect statement. You have, and that sua imperia, right, his powers were, esse, right, they were of such a sort, eius modi, you could translate, right, his powers or his own imperia, right, his own leadership and power were of such a sort that he haberet, right, he had, so in other words, you're going to have two things happening here, right? So he's talking about what he has over the people and what the people have over him. So your subject here is multitudo, right? I kind of said that backwards. But you're saying he said that the crowd, haberet, had no less juris authority over him, in se, you might say, than he himself had, is kind of the implied word, over the crowd. So what's he saying here? He's trying to say that it's all balanced out, right? So he's saying, no, I don't have any power over them. They don't have any power over me, right? We're all kind of sharing this power equally. I didn't want to do it. He's like, I just can't convince the crowd not to do something. Is kind of the way he's setting up this blame. So again, this is kind of an interesting way of Ambiorix, shifting blame, right? He's like, I don't look at me that they attacked, right? And again, it goes back to what he said in the beginning. I love Caesar. Okay. Then you have the next line. You have civitati poro, hanc fuisse belli causam quod repentinae gallorum coniurationi resistere non potuere. Okay, so again, so you have moreover. He starts with moreover, right? Poro, right? Moreover. Then he has civitati here, to the state, right? So moreover that, he said that to the state, right? Hanc, this thing, you might even say, this had been the causam belli, had been the cause of war. Okay, so he's about to explain this to the state. This had been the cause of war. And he keeps going. He says that the state, right, which is kind of what he's mentioning, because the state is the implied subject here, non potuere, was not able to resist, right? It was not able to resist the repentinae coniurationi, the sudden conspiracy of the Gauls, the sudden sort of rebellion of the Gauls. He's saying we weren't able to stop this. This all kind of got out of hand, and this is why this all happened, right? He's kind of giving a bunch of excuses why. And he's like, no, it wasn't us. All of Gaul is rebelling, right? We just got caught up in it. Then he continues, and you have id se facile ex humilitate sua probare posse, quod non adeo sit imperitus rerum ut suis copis populum Romanum superare posse confidat. Okay, so he says that, and it's kind of continuing, right? Continuing on what he had just been saying. And he says that, excuse me, he, right, it's again indirect statement, he was able to prove this, right? So posse probare, he was able to prove this, right? Easily, facile, he was easily able to prove this from his own humilitate, his own sort of weak position, almost like weakness, right? He's like, look at me, what am my lowly position, right? My low power, what am I supposed to do? Okay. And then you have because he was, right, non adeo sit, right? He was not so imperatus, right? The idea would mean like so there, that he was not so unskilled of things, imperatus rerum, right? Meaning unskilled of things, meaning like he kind of knows what's going on, right? He said, I'm not so stupid or unskilled that he believed, confida, right? That he believed that, right? He was able, posse, or sorry, the populum Romanum, rather, the Roman people, posse, were able, superare, to be conquered by, right? So you have the passive there, it's going with the ablative here, by his own troops, right? So he's saying again, he's like, look at me. You really think I would start a rebellion? He says, look at my position. I'm so weak, right? There's not a lot going on. And he says, I'm not so unskilled or so stupid that I would actually believe that the Roman people could ever be conquered by my lowly troops, right? So again, this is an interesting excuse he's giving because remember, it's being written by Caesar. So Caesar's putting these words into his mouth, right? And it does kind of play into Roman sort of vanity. Like, look, no, I would never think that. How could we possibly defeat you, right? That's an interesting kind of turn of phrase that Ambiorix uses here. And again, it's because it's being written by Caesar. Okay. Then you have said esse Galliae commune consilium, omnibus hibernis Caesaris appugnandis hunc esse dictum diem, ne qua legio alterae legioni subsidio venire posset. Okay. He says, but, right, so again, Ambiorix is talking, he says, we weren't able to do this, but it was, or that it was, again, because locutus est, it's setting up the whole indirect statement, right, that he said, right, that it was the common plan, the commune consilium, the common plan of Gaul, right, of all of Gaul, and this is what it is, right, that this, right, hunc, this was the dictum diem, the set day or the appointed day, right? So he says, this is our common plan, that today, right, or the attack we just had was the appointed day or the set day for the, for assaulting, rather, appugnandis, right, for assaulting, the gerundive there, for assaulting omnibus hibernis, all the winter quarters of Caesar. So in other words, it's saying the Gauls, all the Gauls, they conspired and said, this is the day that we're going to attack everyone at once, right? We are going to attack all the winter quarters of Caesar at the same time. That's interesting because, again, that's not what happened. This is the trick, right? The only camp that it's been attacked is Sabinus and Caudas, right? But he's saying, no, we're attacking everyone at once, right? This was our plan. Then you have the negative purpose clause to finish it, right? The ne. You have so that, or sometimes you see lest in English, which is a little bit old-fashioned, but so that not any legion, qua legio, not any legion posset venire was able to come to another, right, to alterae legione, to another legion for help, subsidio. So in other words, Ambiorix is saying if we attack all of them at once, they're not able to help each other, and this is our sort of master plan, okay? And then this part of the chapter ends with this line, right? You have non facile Gallos, Gallis negare potuisse, praesertim cum de recuperanda communi libertate, consilium enitum videretur, right? So it says that, right, it seemed that, right, you have the videretur, right? So it says it seemed that not easily, or even you could just take the first part again as the indirect statement. So let's kind of reboot that. He says that it non potuisse, right? That Gauls, that's kind of your subject of the indirect statement there, right? Gallos. So Gauls had not been able easily to negare Galles, to deny other Gauls, right? So in other words, he's saying if everyone was attacking at once, it wasn't easy for any of the Gauls to deny other Gauls because these are your people, right? And then he says praesertim, right? Especially since, right, concerning rather the recuperanda communi libertate, right, concerning recuperanda, the regaining of communal freedom, right, or communal liberty. Now, this is where the videretur comes into play, right? So it's saying, especially since the concilium, right, the plan seemed, or you might even say it seemed that the plan had begun, right? The plan had begun. Initum is really initum esse, right? That the plan seemed to have been begun or begun for the regaining of communal freedom, or concerning the regaining of sort of communal freedom or common freedom, common liberty. So again, this ending line is Ambiorix saying, look, this plan already started, right? There already was a plan, or it seemed that there already was a plan in place for regaining everyone's freedom. And he's saying if that was already the case, right, that people had planned freedom for all the Gauls, how is it possible for Gauls to deny other Gauls? Remember, he's not really talking about himself necessarily. He's talking about his people. He's like, I don't have any power over the people, but it seemed that this plan had already started. We got caught up in it. What did you want me to do? Right? This is sort of the great excuse of Ambiorix. What could I have done? Right? I don't have any power. And again, it's just a fascinating way of kind of putting this all together, right? Because these are not necessarily the words of Ambiorix. We don't know what Ambiorix said. We know what Caesar is telling us that he said. And that should always get your attention. Okay. So here's a couple of questions to think about. Again, we point out this is all one large indirect statement. We just said it. Caesar wasn't there. He doesn't know what was said. This is his version. And he's very careful about how he crafts the narrative of what Ambiorix said. So think about what Ambiorix says about Caesar, right? The words that Caesar has him speak. I owe everything to Caesar, right? Why do you think you would report the speech like this? Well, it makes him look good, right? It's just an interesting start. I love Caesar. I owe everything. But it would also kind of trick the Romans, right? If you are trying to trick them, it's not the worst thing in the world to say, right? So who knows? Maybe you did say that. Who's Ambiorix blaming for the rebellion? He's talking about his people, right? He says, no, it wasn't me, right? Just remember, I didn't do it. My people did. And you want to remember, as he's laying the blame for other Gauls, or the peer pressure almost, Ambiorix is really trying to get the Romans out of their camp. That's what he's trying to do. And think about, do you find this persuasive, right? If you had the leader come up to you and say, I'm really sorry about that attack, guys, right? That wasn't my fault. I love Caesar, but they made me do it. If you guys just come out, I'll help you, right? I'll help you get the real bad guys. It might be persuasive, maybe, right? It kind of depends, but that's what Caesar's laying out here for us. Okay. And then notice how Caesar just has Ambiorix describe the Roman people and the Roman army. That's an interesting way that he plays it out, because again, these are Caesar's words through Ambiorix, and it's a really clever way to kind of persuade people. And by that, I mean Caesar persuading his own audience. It's just interesting, right? He's persuading his audience by making a speech from another person, right? Talking about his audience, if that all kind of makes sense. So it's an interesting speech, and we're going to keep going with it. But this first part, there's a lot to unpack, and I'll kind of explain to you what's going on here and the big excuse of Ambiorix saying, no, it wasn't my fault, okay? So there are some tricky things here. The hardest part, I would say, reading through this is just keeping or trying to remember this is all one large indirect statement. So when you translate it, you have to keep that in mind. It's all set off by locutus s, right? He said all these things. You're looking for different infinitives and accusatives, and that if you kind of have that be your guidepost, it'll get you through this first part of the chapter, hopefully without too much trouble. But there are a few other sort of tricky things in there. You have some gerundive stuff like that. But I think the trickiest part for my students is just remembering that this is all one giant indirect statement, okay? And we're not done with the chapter yet, so kind of hold on to what we're talking about, and we'll finish the second part in another video, just so that these videos don't get too overwhelmingly long in terms of how long it takes to translate it. So there is another paragraph left. We'll take that in another one. But if you have any questions at all about what we've done so far, put them in the comments below. I'm happy to help you or explain everything, because again, not that my translation is ever the best, but if you've already done the read and reread method and you feel like you have a good translation, hopefully this is helping you double check yours, maybe explain a few things, and getting you to feel confident that you can move on with the rest of the chapter. Good luck.